I recently had a comment on one of my posts asking me why that item was handmade. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to say a few things about what handmade means to me. There are several schools of thought as to what handmade generally means. Um, as a general rule, it means making something with your hands. But it comes at all different levels. You'll have the very soft core hand makers who think that, maybe they're POD sellers. So they took a design, a clip art, they uploaded it to a computer, they maybe did a little bit of alteration to the design, and they sent it off somewhere to be printed on a mug that gets sent directly to somebody. Some people class that as handmade. Most people would not, although it still seems to slip through the net for a lot of handmade e-commerce sites. There is the more reasonable version, which is that you gather together the base elements that you need to make something, and then you make it yourself. So, for instance, with my jewellery, everything I make is made from broken jewellery pieces. It might be someone had a packet of beads in the cupboard and they were going to throw it out and it never became anything because they were a crafter and they never used something. And I will bring all the elements together. So the broken unwanted jewellery that would have ended up in the bin, I will buy findings. And by findings we mean things like earring wires, connectors, because if I only made jewellery entirely from things that I found, I probably wouldn't make it, because whereas it's quite easy to get hold of unwanted, seed beads, chunky beads, maybe some connectors, very often you don't find those small elements like the clasps for necklaces and the earring wires. And I also think that not a lot of people want a second-hand earring wire that's been in somebody else's ears. And with connectors and with clasps, those clasps might be really old and they may not work properly. So you bring in those elements that help you to turn those unwanted broken bits of jewellery, those broken chains, those beads, those chunky bits of metal, and it enables you to bring them together and turn them into something that I then do by hand. And I've shown elements of how I work. I work here in this studio. Everything I do is made by hand by me here. I don't outsource to anybody. It is handmade, but I have to bring the elements together. I'm not hand firing my own wires. I'm not making beads from scratch, because that would be crazy. When it comes to my garments, I class all my garments as handmade, but I'm not I'm not weaving my own fabric, because again, I work on a circular economy basis. So I get my fabrics from dead stock, from scrap fabrics that would have gone into landfill or the bin, and from other garments that I have taken apart and reused. So it's circular economy. I design my own garments. I don't steal other people's stuff. When I'm designing something that requires a pattern, I have a big roll of pattern paper, and I have my scissors, and I have a French curve which enables me to draw the right angles for things like waistlines, and it has the measurements on it, and I do it all myself by hand. I don't even design my patterns on a computer using CAD. It's all done by hand because that's the way I was taught, and that's what I love to do. I cut out the patterns on the fabric, I pin it, I tack it, I sew it on my own sewing machine here, which is next to me now, which I bought gosh, when did I buy that? 2017, I think. It's from an old factory. It's a semi-industrial. It's 12.5 stone of cast iron metal, and it's just brilliant because it sews through absolutely anything. It'll do everything from fine silks up to leather and denim. So that's what I class as handmade. I sew in the labels, I do the photography, I write the listings, I do everything. That is handmade. Now, there are hardcore people who think that unless you're making every single component from scratch, it is not classed as handmade. Maybe if you're up on the Isle of Harris and you're making garments up there from Harris tweed, you may be lucky enough to be able to weave your own fabrics from scratch, because Harris tweed has to be woven on the Isle of Harris. It's as simple as that. But I'm not doing a heritage brand here, and that's not what I do. And different crafts will have different ideas as to what counts as handmade. If you're a woodworker, getting the base plank of wood or the chunk of wood and carving it by hand may be what you count as handmade. Someone else who finishes wood, say for instance, they might buy in the pieces ready made and then build the piece of furniture, and they might finish off the wood. That might count as handmade, but it depends a lot on your industry. So everything I do is handmade within the limitations of what I can do. I don't hand fire my own glass beads. I'm not making my own ear wires and pressing my own connectors in some kind of factory. And then you might complain that if I did that myself by hand and I used a machine, well, that's not handmade, you used a machine to do it. It's an endless argument. But everything that you see is handmade. The braided coasters, for instance, all the fabric for those comes from the leftovers from the garments that I've made. And then I cut it all into strips, I hand braid it, and I hand sew it together. That is handmade. I'm not weaving my own fabric because I can't. So that's my definition of handmade. I hope that has been useful for any of you who are looking at my uploads and thinking, well, that isn't handmade. How did you make that by hand? I hope that's an explanation. I'm always happy to answer questions. If there's something that you see and you want to understand how handmade it is, or you want to know what my processes are, just ask. That's what the comments are here for. And I'm more than happy to answer questions on relatively where things came from. I can't remember entirely, because a lot of the items that I'm using, particularly for the jewellery, some of it I've had for years. Some of it will have come out of, I found junk. A lot of the time people offload their stuff onto me when they've had a clear out. It's better than it going in the bin, and I can use things that way. But some of this stuff I've collected over years and years, and it's sat in boxes, and then I start to look through, depending on what I'm making, depending on what mood I'm in, the time of year. I tend not to make a lot of things in the winter because my brain doesn't like winter and short daylight hours and the cold, so I tend not to make anything in winter. Anyway, so that's my definition of handmade. Other people will have other definitions, but I hope that's been helpful. Thank you for watching.